Hi, welcome back. In this lecture, I want to introduce a very important tool called perf that allows us to assess the hardware counter. So it's going to give us a low-level perspective about performance. Well, low level, I mean we are going to assess counters that are hardware, so very low level, and see how much they are used and how certain events happens, how many times a certain events happens during the profiling. By the end of this lecture, we'll be able to use the perf tool to analyze and fine-grain low-level performance of a computer system. So the perf tools, unfortunately, is only available on Linux machine. So many of these results that I'm going to show you today are obtained on the Linux machine. So Mac and Windows machine have a similar tool, but not as powerful as the perf. So this we'll be able to use perf, but this is going to be only on the Linux machine. By the end of this lecture, also we'll be able to describe different events that leads to the degradation of performance. So perf will tell some numbers that are relevant to the hardware counters that tell us how good or how bad we're using the computer system. So the low-level profiling memory that we're going to do today is used by using perf. As I said, is only available on Linux. Perf allows us to probe how well memory is being used, especially for moving data from the memory to the CPU. This is actually quite hard to monitor, and perf allows us to do that. Perf allows us to obtain low-level profiling information. The way to use it is very simple. So we use the command perf that is available on the Linux system, and then we have a flag -e, and then we tell what is the name of the performance counter that we want to monitor. So performance counter 1, 2, 3, and 4. After that, we need to say which code we want to profile. So we need to call Python and then the name of our code. How do we get the names of this counter here? Well, there is a list available online, also on Canvas, but the best way to do that is to check which available counters are available on the system that they're going to use when using perf. To do that, we do perf and list, and we will get a list of all the hardware counters that we can monitor using perf. I posted a tutorial on Canvas, so feel free to go there and check it. Let's go back to our diffusion code, and what we're going to do is to monitor the performance using the perf tool. So as I tell you, we do perf, in this case stat e, and then we tell which counters we want to profile. So the number of performance metrics that we want to have during this profiling. So in this case, one performance monitor counter is the cycles, one is instructions. Then we want to check what are the cache references, cache misses, branch misses, task clock, faults, minor faults, CS, that stands for context switch, migration. And these are going to be the counters that we want to check. So we have a bunch of them, right? From how much we use caches, page fault, branches. And then finally we put Python and then the name of the code that you want to profile. Once we run this, that's what we get. So we get this list. It's going to tell how much time it takes. And then it's going to take all the measurement of the hardware counters that we ask to perf to profile. So let's look at more detail the perf page. So the first thing is really about the instruction. So instruction tells us how many CPU instructions our code issued. So that is the part here. The interesting part here for us is really this number here, that is instruction per cycle. So this we see that for each cycle we are going to do on average 291 instruction per cycle. So almost 3 instructions per cycle. That means that hardware technique like a pipeline is capable of running more than one instruction per cycle. Right? So it might be vectorization, might be pipelining, might be prefetching. Now, different techniques allow us to have more than one instruction per cycle executed. The other counter that is interesting is really the cycle here. That is how many cycles it took to run all the instruction. So the difference between the instruction and cycle tell us how good the code has been vectorized and pipelined. A second important counter to always check is really the number of context switches and CPU migration. Context switches and CPU migration tell us about how the program is halted in order to wait for a kernel operation to finish. So for instance, if we do an I operation, then we will have a context switch because we have the kernel operation, we need to wait. So our application stops, right? And that's is a cause of performance degradation. The context switch are very time intensive tasks, so we want to have the least number of context switch. And in practice, we don't have too much control when this happens. In reality, there are some few techniques on how to handle I/O to do asynchronous, but is quite complex that topic. So the context switch is definitely something to look at all the time, and it's typically because of our program is stopping because it's waiting for some kernel operation, typically I/O. Another example of a context switch is, but even more serious than normal context switch, it is so-called the CPU migration. So with the CPU migration, the program is stopped, so it's halted, and assumed on a different CPU or core than the one that is done before. So that all the CPU have pretty much the same level of utilization. So this is why this is bad. It's particularly bad form of context switch. Well, the problem here is that not only the program is halted temporarily, but also we lose all the data on our L1 cache, right, that are of that particular core. Migration can be told as a very bad context switch. And perf allow us to get these two numbers, context switch and CPU migration. Another important factor to always monitor when running our code is the number of page fault. A page fault, or you might hear also just fault, is actually a part of the modern memory allocation scheme. In fact, when memory is allocated, the kernel doesn't do much except give the program a reference to the memory. So it returns right away, just give a reference. However, later on, when the memory is first used, the OS throws a minor page fault interrupt, which pauses the program that is being run and properly allocates the memory. So whenever we access the first time, the OS comes in, it makes this minor page fault interrupt that stops the program and properly allocates the memory. We make a difference between minor and major page faults. So minor page faults are really when we allocate in memory. They are quite expensive and they are referred just to this memory allocation. When we access the first time, we need to halt our application and give to the OS. So these are minor page fault that because of the memory. There is also a major page fault. This happens when the program requests data from a device, for instance, a disk, a network that has been read yet. So these are even more expensive than minor page fault. And not only they interrupt the program, but they also involve reading from whichever device the data lives on. So it takes also in account the times to take the data from I/O, network, or for an accelerator. These two numbers are quite important. In this case, we don't do any I/O. You see that all the faults are basically minor faults, so due to the access to allocation to the memory. Another very important other content we always need to check is really how well and how much our cache system is used. So whenever we reference data that is in our cache, the cache references metric increase. So in this case, when this number goes up, it's very good. That means that our data is in the cache. If we do not have already this data in the cache and need to fetch it from the RAM, this counts as a cache miss. So we want this counter as small as possible. So cache misses are bad for performance, so can be a source of slowdowns, since we need to wait to fetch data from RAM, and we need to interrupt the flow of the execution pipeline, right? So we need to fill the cache. So any cache miss for us is quite bad. So in this particular case, we see in the diffusion code that we look at in the previous lecture, we see that 50% of the times we have a cache miss, right? And that's quite a bad number. It's quite high. We want to reduce as little as possible, to 10, 5, 2%, and we want to reuse most of the data. So the code we have here, as you see, 50% of the times we have a cache miss. That's quite bad. So definitely cache is really an issue for the performance in this particular code. A point is also look at the branches and branch misses. A branch is a time in the code where execution flow changes. Think about the if-then statement. That's a branch. To optimize this, modern computer architecture, especially with regards to the pipeline, try to guess which direction of the branch will take and preload the relevant instruction. When this prediction about where the if-then goes is incorrect, we will have a branch miss. Right? Branch miss can be quite confusing and can result in many strange effects. For example, in some loops will run substantially faster on sorted list than on unsorted list, simply because there will be fewer branch. So sometimes it can give up some interesting performance results. So to summarize this lecture, I present you the perf tool that allows us to analyze the fine-grained performance of a computer system on Linux machine. And then we look at different sources of performance degradation, context switch, CPU migration, page fault. They can be minor or major, depending if it's memory or some device, like I/O or a network. Cache misses. We saw that particularly diffusion code is not good with caches. And then we touch upon about branch misses. All these aspects are major cause of performance degradation, and we should always monitor them to see first what is the performance on our code, and second which part of the computer system we can optimize for. This is the last slides of this lecture, and talk to you soon.